All right, let's get right into it. We're going to tackle one of the absolute cornerstones of global trade, and also one of the most misunderstood. We're talking about Incoterms.
So picture this, right? You've got two companies, they've just shaken hands on a deal. Everything's perfect, the product, the price, the quantity. But there's a huge problem hiding in plain sight. The buyer thinks the seller is handling all the shipping costs. Meanwhile, the seller is 100% sure that's the buyer's job.
So who's right? And maybe more importantly, when those goods are just sitting at a port, racking up fees, who's going to pay for that massive mistake? Well, this exact nightmare scenario is why Incoterms even exist.
And that brings us right to our first part here, which is all about that classic deal gone wrong. And believe me, this isn't some textbook example. This kind of thing happens all the time, every single day, which is exactly why a shared rulebook was so desperately needed.
And that solution, that shared language, is called Incoterms. The best way to think about them is like a universal translator, but for shipping responsibilities. It's all about making sure everyone's reading from the same script, whether you're in Shanghai or Chicago. So let's dig into that. Where did this shared language actually come from? And why is it so important for anyone, and I mean anyone, who buys or sells things internationally?
Believe it or not, these rules have been around for a while. They were first created way back in 1936 by the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Let's just standardize all these shipping terms that companies were using in wildly different ways. And they've been updating them ever since to keep up with modern trade. The version we're all using today is Incoterms 2020.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. We have to be super clear about what these rules do cover and, maybe even more importantly, what they don't cover. Honestly, getting this distinction right is half the battle. At their heart, Incoterms solve four huge potential headaches. First, they pinpoint the exact moment of delivery. Second, they tell you when the risk, for loss or damage, officially shifts from seller to buyer. Third, they spell out who pays for what costs. And fourth, they make it clear who's handling all the export and import paperwork. That's their job, plain and simple. But, and this is a huge but that trips up so many people, Incoterms are not your entire sales contract. They say nothing about when you officially own the goods. They don't set your payment terms. They won't help you if there's a legal dispute. They're just a framework for the delivery part of the deal, not the whole shebang. All right, so there are 11 different Incoterms, and if you try to memorize them all, you're just going to give yourself a headache, trust me. So let's look at this in a much smarter, simpler way.
Instead of a long, boring list, imagine a spectrum or a sliding scale. On one end of the scale, the seller does almost nothing. On the complete opposite end, the seller does, well, pretty much everything.
And this shows you those two extremes perfectly. Over on the left, you've got EXW, which stands for Ex Works. That's the absolute minimum the seller can do. Then, all the way on the other side, you've got DDP, or Delivered Duty Paid. That's the maximum responsibility for the seller. Every other rule, all 9 of them, just fits somewhere along that line. Okay, so understanding that spectrum is a fantastic start. But now, we've got to talk about the single biggest, most common mistake people make. It's a real trap, and it's all about cost versus risk. Before we go any further, let's get one term absolutely nailed down: risk transfer. What does that mean? It's simply the precise point in the journey where the responsibility for the goods, like if they fall off the ship or get damaged, switches from the seller's problem to the buyer's problem. So here's the thought process that seems totally logical, right? You think, okay, the seller is paying for the big ocean voyage from one country to another. So naturally, they must be on the hook for the risk during that whole trip. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, this is the trap I was talking about. Because for a whole group of rules known as the C rules, that's just plain wrong. With these rules, the seller pays for the freight all the way to the final destination port. But, and listen closely, the risk transfers to the buyer way back at the start of the journey. The second those goods are on the truck or ship, it's the buyer's risk. It's a critical point. Who pays for the cost and who holds the risk are not always the same thing.
So after hearing that, you're probably wondering, how on earth do I avoid that trap and figure this stuff out? Well, the good news is you don't have to memorize anything. All you need is a simple, practical set of questions. Next time you look at a contract with an Incoterm, just run through this mental checklist. Ask yourself these 4 questions. 1. Where does delivery officially happen? 2. When exactly does the risk transfer? 3. Who is paying for which parts of the trip? And 4, who's handling customs? If you can answer those 4 things, you've got it. You're in control.
And really, that brings us to the most important question you can ask yourself. When you look at your next deal, just stop and think. Does the Incoterm we picked make everything crystal clear? Or is it maybe, just maybe, hiding a huge risk that you assume someone else was taking care of? Getting that answer right, well, that could literally save you a fortune.